the concept of the big sanctuary has been proven. Megasanctuary has proven that we can clear those areas up to 3,000 hectares and keep them clear. So if you had 10 of them with up to, say, 3,000 hectares each, or around then you're talking about 20 to 30,000 hectares of predator-free habitat. Now, that's more than enough to secure all of the forest species that we have forever. And the good thing about distributing it like that across the country too is that you insure against catastrophe. So if there's a major drought in Northland, then the hihi there might be catastrophically affected, but the hihi in Wellington may not be. Or you might get a disease outbreak somewhere in the North Island, and with climate change coming, that's becoming more and more important.
Hello, kia ora, and welcome to the People Helping Nature podcast, brought to you by Conservation Amplified. Our show features the stories of people who are helping nature to bring more awareness to this amazing space. I'm Callum.
And I'm Anna. And in today's episode, we're joined by Jim Lynch. Kia ora, Jim. Thank you for being on board today.
Kia ora, Callum and Anna. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we'd love to start by introducing yourself and your background to forest and bird, Zealandia, and the Megasanctuaries we're about to talk about.
Sure. Well, my wife Eve and I got into conservation in about 1989 when we were members of the Wellington branch of Forest and Bird, and we attended an Earth Day out at Percy's Reserve at Lower Hutt. And Colin Ryder, the local president, grabbed us because he heard that we did strategic planning and management systems design in our business. And he said, we want you on our committee because we need a plan for Wellington. So he gave me the title, the rather effusive title of Vice President Planning for the branch, and said, go to it. And we had a lovely time around the next couple of years producing a plan which was called Natural Wellington. That was really where all of it kicked off. Before that...
When was that?
That was 1990. The plan was written in 1990 and launched in 1990 under Forest and Birds auspices. Before that, we'd been what I call sleeping greenies. So when I was a young fellow, I was very interested in birds. I used to collect all the Buller's bird pictures off the school writing pads. And we had a wonderful book, a school book, which had New Zealand fauna in it. And I studied it very closely. And we had some birds. We had kiwis in the bush at home. But we really didn't do much about that at all, actually. And we got very interested in tramping in the 1980s, and we tramped around New Zealand and had a lovely time. But until 1990, we really didn't get involved at all.
So, and then through that planning, you came up with a concept for Zealandia. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, the plan for Natural Wellington, it's more key to this whole thing than people realise, actually. Natural Wellington was produced by the branch, and it was presented to the Wellington Regional Council, I think in about March 1990. It was received exceptionally well because Wellington City was, the mayor at that time was Fran Wild. There was quite a green council, and the big thing about Natural Wellington was its theme was to bring the birds back to Wellington. And the reason for that was when we did this plan, we found that Wellington was in probably the worst biological state that you could possibly imagine. I call it a biological cot case. There are only 9 species of native forest birds left in the city, and some of those were in tiny numbers. Bellbirds had become extinct in the 1950s, and so had whiteheads. So it was in a parlous state. So the whole Wellington Peninsula, which was about 29,000 hectares, was completely burnt off, apart from 5 hectares in Otari. And I can say now that Wellington is the opposite. Wellington is now a biological showcase, and the city styles itself as a biophilic city. Conservation is entrenched in the city's plans. You couldn't get it out with a crowbar now. And when we started, the total amount expended on conservation around the city would have been no more than about $100,000, which was mostly Otari's budget. That's Otari's and our native plant museum. We had a museum for native plants, believe it or not. It just shows how bad things were. And the amount of forest now growing around Wellington has rapidly increased. It's increasing all the time, and it's the reforestation is now up to about 5%, and it'll probably get up to about 10% from nothing. As you mentioned, the bird life around Wellington has exploded, and Wellington has probably houses one of the largest, if not the largest, population of kaka in the North Island. And tuis are in every garden in New Zealand. Instead of having half a dozen tuis, we now have them in every garden in New Zealand. We have bellbirds back. Karori are now common. They're now being predated on by native falcons.
Wow.
And and all of this is not. All of this is now proven by scientific papers. Scientific papers have been written about this and have proven this effect of the dramatically increasing. So almost in every key indicator, fauna, there are now 18 species of native bird now living in Wellington City with viable populations. So it's double the number of native birds. And the abundance has dramatically increased on almost all counts. So
fantastic. So there was an ecological wasteland, a court case, as you put it, and we've gone to what is a model for conservation and so many indicators. And I know that Zealandia, the fence sanctuary in Karori Valley, was a big part of that. But how did you evolve to that? And what is Zealandia? What role did it play building on top of that natural Wellington strategy?
Sure. Well, the whole idea, of course, in Wellington was to bring back the birds and to prevent local extinction and to bring abundance back into the city. So that's worked. But where it came from was when we were doing the survey, I thought this is so bad that we have to do something quite dramatic here to make this work. How do we actually achieve those goals? When we did the survey, the place which I found which was most interesting was the Karori Reservoir. The old Karori Reservoir was land which was set aside. It was burnt off originally in 1845, the whole valley. There's a valley of 250 hectares, a full square mile, which is located just behind the Karori Tunnel. And it's no more than 2 kilometres from downtown Wellington. It's actually part of the Wellington Fault. When Wellington was young, this was set aside as water supply area and a dam was built. And a second dam was built further up the valley later on. So this land was put aside. It was burnt, and it was a lot of pine trees were planted in there for experiments and for commercial work. And some of those were harvested. But eventually, most of it just started regenerating back to indigenous forest. So its strategic location was really what captivated me, and its size. It was a good size, 250 hectares a square mile. That's as big as Doc's middle range islands like Mana Island and Tiritiri-Matangi and Ulva and those sort of islands. So it had enough size. Its location was amazing, and it had potential for restoration. But how do you do that in a city? And where the idea of Zealandia came from was our branch had been given a talk by Alan Saunders, who was the Department of Conservation's threatened species manager at the time, on a concept that they called mainland islands. And they'd started this mainland island idea in Mapara Forest in the King Country, which is about 1,000 hectares of tawa forest, to save a population of kokako. The kokako population there was down to about 25 birds. And they basically threw everything at this forest, tried to kill every pest. Over time, quite quickly, the kokako population recovered, and there's now about 200 or 300 birds there. In fact, I think it's more now. So it was quite a success. And this captivated the national conservation movement and sort of took off. That model became quite a major movement across the country for quite a while. Still is, actually. I thought, well, we need one of those in Wellington. I know exactly where the place should be because we found it. So I talked to Alan about it, and he said, oh, yeah, well, doing it in a city would be very difficult. Shortly afterwards, we were visiting friends in Kaitaia, and they took us out to this place where a guy called Don McKenzie, who was the local Department of Conservation ranger, was working with a chap to try and keep rats out of a small pocket of bush by way of an electric fence. And the electric fence was just one. It was a one-wire fence, which was close to the ground, and the whole idea was to put 50,000 volts in a pulse into the ground. And when a rat came up to this fence, it would get, zapped. And anyway, that idea didn't really work. Too many problems going for it. But what it did is it planted the idea of a fence into my mind, and I thought, wow, a fence. Why not fence everything out? And of course, I brought up on a farm, so in farms you have fences all over the place to keep things in, keep animals in. And I knew that there had been some experiments in New Zealand with fences to keep possums out and stoats out. So in my imagination, all I thought was, well, you just got to make it a bit tighter and keep rats and cats out, and you've got a winner. So there was a fence in Burwood Bush to keep stoats out of the Tākehī Ranch, and there was another fence being built at Tirafiti and Russell to keep possums off the Russell Peninsula.
So it was used in other places, but just not in the way that Zealandia had it. It was a concept that had potential, but it wasn't quite there. Is that
Correct?
sort of?
Yeah, small scale. So what Zealandia was a merging of about two or three concepts. One was mainland islands, which are sort of safe zones for species, fencing. The third thing was that what I saw was that had potential, because of my business background, it had potential to have a economic and social arm to it and make it economically viable in the long term, and to be able to sort of earn its own income, because the plague of conservation is that it's always a cost. It's never a profit. People don't look at the benefits so much. They look at profits and costs. So I thought that if we could come up with a model which could at least even partly pay its own way, it would be a major breakthrough. The other thing about Zealandia, the Zealandia model, was it needs to last forever. And the plague of conservation projects is they're started by one or two people, and usually old people. In a decade or so, those people die off and the whole thing stops.
Which incidentally is a situation that a lot of conservation groups are facing in the next 10 to 20 years, as it is,
Precisely.
right?
Yeah. And while you can get people coming in at the bottom, it's very difficult. So, so at that stage, the trust model, which is now endemic around New Zealand, was just never looked at. Nobody thought of a self-perpetuating trust. So the whole idea of Karori, which has been quite a major thing for conservation around New Zealand, was to form these community trusts, a community trust that would be able to last forever, would perpetuate itself and have a self-renewing ability about it, and look after the fence, because when you build a fence, it's a major capital commitment, and you have to actually make it work economically on the longer term. So those are the four elements of Zealandia, which was called Karori Wildlife Sanctuary in those days. Was a mainland island, a safe place for species to breed. Secondly was a fence, which would be absolute proof against all invasive species and enable us to make it predator-free habitat, totally predator-free habitat, which mainland islands can't do. And thirdly, to have a social aspect for it, so people could get involved and become volunteers and actually engage in it, even have a stake in it by being involved in a trust as members, so that the community gets ownership to it. And the fourth thing, of course, is to make it economically viable, so it'll last hundreds of years.
Speaking of your fourth point about the funding sources, in your book Zealandia, you talk about how that was really critical because you could take money from volunteer community donations, from councils, from grants, from business income, from tours, and that a lot of the other projects that have one or two single sources of income couldn't do that, which made it gave your options a lot wider, right?
Correct. That's correct. Yeah, in fact, the idea was to set Karori up with as many revenue streams as possible. So those would be membership fees, grants and donations, and income from merchandising, gate takings, and any other commercial ventures that were necessary. And that's worked quite well.
And I guess in doing that, not only do you raise awareness, but you have this income stream of new volunteers because people learn and want to get involved. Did you find that you were creating your own community flywheel?
Absolutely. The community aspect to it initially was very, very important. And our members really kept us going for the first 20 years.
Wow.
And we're quite the lifeblood of the... without them, we wouldn't have succeeded, to be honest. When you start these things, you have this, what I call the entrepreneurial culture.
Yeah.
So entrepreneurship is not just business. You get massive entrepreneurship in community groups as well. And these are people who take all sorts of risks, Some of them no business person would take those risks. I mean, if you assess the risks around building the fence and trying to do all the things that we did at Karori with no money, I mean, you'd be laughed out of a bank, They wouldn't have you anywhere near it. So it's almost extreme entrepreneurship, and there's no way a council or a doc could have built Karori. It just couldn't have happened. So that culture was quite dramatic, and all the people who went through it at the time now would regard that as a very special time in their lives. But that all changed because in 2015, basically the council took over Zealandia. But for all that, I mean, Zealandia is massively successful. It earns about $6 million a year now.
Wow.
Probably the best funded conservation project in New Zealand by some margin, a long margin actually. A lot of sanctuaries popped up around New Zealand at the time. There was about 10 fence sanctuaries of significant scale around the country. So it was a model which was replicated quite quickly. Even before we built the fence, we had people racing in trying to inquire about it because there was so much excitement being caused by this idea. And the whole thing became a bit of a movement. It ground to a halt about 2010 for various reasons, which I'll explain shortly. One thing I'd like to go back to on the Karori model, which is absolutely key to the whole thing and for any future developments which run off it, is what I call the nursery and halo model. It's a sort of name I coined way back when I started because I saw that these places, they wouldn't be just zoos, they wouldn't be a place to contain wildlife. I always saw them as a safe haven, like a nursery where species could breed in safety. And then when the population fills up that space, the safe space, it would start flowing out into the wider hinterland. And if you had habitat around it, then you'd get this multiplier effect, a massive multiplier effect. So one of the keys to Zealandia at the same time was to also have this business of the outer town belt, where habitat surrounds it. That was absolutely key to it, and that's happening.
Just to confirm that we've got this correct, the nursery and halo model is where you have a completely predator-free, maybe except for mice, area which is surrounded by a specialized fence, and then
Correct.
you have habitat and trapping activities and biodiversity activities outside of that where it's not predator free but it's pretty safe, so that you can introduce species into the sanctuary like Zealandia, and then
Yeah.
as they expand and become more abundant they can move out, and then you have corridors of forest and ecological hotspots to connect up other areas of nature. Is that
Yeah.
roughly what you were doing, or?
That's pretty spot on, Callum. That's a very good summary. You don't get much halo effect with islands. Islands have the nursery, but they don't have the halo because very few of the birds can fly off the islands. Most of them are contained. So on an island, when the population fills up, animals just stop breeding, really. The breeding slows down and it sort of just fills up the space. So the nursery and halo model, I think, is quite transformative, and we haven't anywhere near begun to cash in on this at a national level. People are still trying to do it without fences. From what I can see, it just doesn't work, or not. It works only only a small margin. So, to my way of thinking, what Zealandia and Wellington has proven is that there is a lot more mileage in this nursery and halo model than we have ever contemplated.
Hmm.
And that's where the next big breakthrough, I think, for conservation will come, and where we have the potential to end extinction and increase abundance.
Yeah, so you've
So,
got a really cool proposal or methodology, which I would love to chat about in a moment. But before we get into that, just to set the stage for what you're planning and looking to build, what were the key lessons from Zealandia that led to thinking maybe this nursery and halo model has wider applicability?
Well, certainly for a start, the nursery was dramatically successful. And, we introduced birds into that place, and species back into that place, which just had never been on the mainland before for 100 years. Little spotted kiwi, saddleback, hihi, tuatara, cookstraight giant weta. Now, those species absolutely need predator-free habitat. They cannot survive without predator-free habitat. The halo for them is limited, though, because they're so sensitive. Once they go outside the fence, then they're unlikely to survive unless you can get the periphery down to zero. So the halo really works for what I'd call the more resilient species. In New Zealand, we have sort of three tiers of resilience. You've got, if you take about 50, we've got about 55 land birds, forest birds, and, field birds. And of those, about 18 get on fine in New Zealand the way it is, Like they don't need any predator control at all. If you look at the OSNZ bird atlas, you'll see that species like white-eye, grey warbler, fantail, harrier hawks, they're everywhere, yeah. Pukeko, paradise ducks. There are quite a bunch of species which are very hardy and very resilient. And in fact, scientific studies in Zealandia showed that some of those birds actually decline in numbers when the other native birds increase in numbers because they're filling vacant spaces.
Right.
Yeah, quite fascinating.
Wow. Didn't know that.
And generally, those species are the ones that have the latest arrivals in New Zealand. They are the most recent arrivals from Australia. So they have built in a resilience. And there's quite a few of them. Then there's another group that not have been here a fair while, but not that long. And they do quite well with a bit of predator control. They don't need to have predator-free. They just need to have a bit of a leg along help. And those are tui, bellbird, kereroo. There's quite a suite of them. There's about a dozen in that category. Then there's another group which do need quite intensive control. Kiwi in that second group, by the way, North Island brown kiwi. In the third group, you're getting species like mohua and red-crowned kakariki and things like that need quite a lot of pest control. And then there's a small group which needs absolutely predator-free. They can't survive without any predators. But there's only about 6 or 7 of those.
What species is that?
Kakapo, little spotted kiwi, takahi, hihi, saddleback, and tuatara, and there's several other things like frogs and lizards as well. So it's actually a very small number that are at risk of extinction and need absolutely predator-free habitat. The rest just need well-managed habitat, really, and sufficient of it. So, logic says to us that if you're going to end extinction, we should really concentrate on safe habitat for those half dozen to 10 birds that really need it, and then manage the rest, manage a big area around it. So that would end extinction, which I would advocate as a very important goal.
I guess it brings us nicely to your concept, which can end extinction forever. Would you like to tell us about that?
Well, yeah, the notion would be to gross up the Wellington model to a national scale. That's basically what it boils down to. And so instead of having a 250 hectare safe zone, let's have a 3,000 to 5,000 hectare safe zone. Instead of having a 5,000 hectare halo zone, let's have a 100,000 hectare halo zone. But to my way of thinking, everything that we've done in Zealandia proves the model. And Wellington proves the model, actually.
Coming to the model, you're taking what is Zealandia and essentially you're blowing it up to a major scale and you're bringing that all around the country and connecting them up. Is that how would that look like? What's the vision and possibilities if you
Well, the vision would be that we'd have so there is a large sanctuary in existence. It's proven the model, and that's Megasanctuary in Cambridge. Megasanctuary is 3,200 hectares. The problem with Megasanctuary is it doesn't have a halo zone of consequence. It's in the middle of farmland. There is another biggish one down in Nelson, which I'm keeping a sharp eye on, called Brook Waimarama, which is about 700 hectares. and that's right on the edges of the Mount Richmond Forest Park and Mount Bryant Range. So it's got a lot of habitat around it. But that's the last sanctuary which had its fence built, so it's in it's still in a development phase, and they haven't really built up their species populations yet. So the concept of the big sanctuary has been proven. Mangatari has proven that we can clear those areas up to 3,000 hectares and keep them clear and run them as a Mangatari do a very good job, because their budget, last time I looked at their budget, was only about $1.5 million a year, so they're very efficient indeed. The other one which I've been advocating is Wainuiomata. Now, this is the last remaining pocket of unlogged rata remu forest in New Zealand.
Wow.
In the southern North Island, rather, of that scale. So it's the headwaters encompass a valley of about 3,300 hectares, and it's all unlogged rata remu forest with massive miro and kaikatea and very big old trees. I saw this in the mid-90s when we were collecting rata for forest and bird, and I couldn't believe it. I thought, this is an incredible place. We took Lou Sanson around there, who was the Director General of Conservation at the time, about 3 years ago. He was blown away. He said, this is the best piece of remu forest he's seen in New Zealand. I took the Kakapo recovery team around Wainuiomata, and they were gobsmacked. They said they didn't think forest like this existed in New Zealand anymore. I'd been hatching this one for quite a while, but I knew at the time the Wellington water wouldn't allow us to go in there. But over time, over the last 20 years, Wellington Regional Council has been progressively managing that area more intensively. They've got a big bait station operation operating over 1,500 hectares in there, and they do intensive hunting of the place. And it was becoming a bit of a never-ending battle. They'd been working away at this for 20 years, but were still not able to reintroduce any species into it. They tried to introduce robins, but they didn't work. So the staff actually came to when I talked to the staff, they said, "Oh, well, is there anything else we can do? Can we fence it?" I said, "If you can find me a fence line, we'll have a go." And anyway, they came back with a fence line, and it turned out, once we put engineers over it, that this was easily fenceable. There's already a deer fence around half of it anyway. So it was a 30-kilometre boundary. So Karori has an 8-kilometre boundary. Mangatari has a 52-kilometre boundary, and this one has a 30-kilometre boundary. It's so efficient, because it's of the shape of the valley. It's so efficient that it's needs 20 kilometres less fencing than Mangatari.
So when you're looking to make a fence, you're looking to find natural geographical features like ridge lines and hills and valleys, rather than, like, if I wanted to make a fence in our backyard, I couldn't just say, "Oh, I'll plop it there. That looks like a good place." You actually want to find areas where you can work with the geography.
Yes and no. Mangatari is fencing a mountain, so
Right.
that's the opposite of a valley. It has a natural boundary with the reserved area, but it also has the difficulty. There's a lot of watercourses coming off it. About 40 watercourses come off the mountain. So there's that sort of difficulty. The thing about a valley is you've usually got one watercourse coming out of it, and that's the case at Karori, which is a dam. So I believe it's more efficient to do a valley. The thing about a valley too is it's moist. The water stays in the valley, and it's more sheltered. You don't get the sort of extremists that you get on the top of a mountain, and generally it's more fertile as well. Unless it's a volcano. Mangatari is a volcano, so it's quite fertile, inherently fertile. So I usually look for valleys in preference, because and there's a sort of a containment element about valleys too. That's not major, but it's natural for wildlife to stay in the valleys as opposed to other things. The other big thing about Wainuiomata, of course, was it's right adjacent to the Rumataka Forest Park and the Wellington Regional Council parks, the other parts of the Wellington water supply area, the Rongorongo catchment, and the Pakuratahi Forest, which is an area reserved by Regional Council for future water management. So around Wainuiomata is at least 50,000 hectares of very high quality habitat. Not only that, but you're only 30 kilometres from downtown Wellington, You've got Wainuiomata and Lower Hutt, which are major city areas right next to it. You can generate the same social and economic model that Zealandia has, but on a massive scale.
Okay,
With
so the
car control.
Wainuiomata, that's got a really great opportunity to fence that off and scale up the Zealandia model. But let's just move on to how that gets to the future we're talking about with ending extinction.
Essentially, we're talking about copying and pasting that New Zealand wide, right? To have more
Correct.
protected dots, halo zones, and then ultimately connecting all of these
Correct.
for
Well, the
wildlife
thing
to
is,
thrive.
if I was given a big checkbook to do this, I'd pick 10 initially and start with that. And where I would go is you have to distribute them across the country, because there are some species that live in the South Island, some in the North Island, and you have different habitats in different places. Like Northland habitat is quite different to Southland habitat. You've got Karori forest in the north. So in the north, I'd go to somewhere like Waipoua forest, which is
Tane Mahuta.
in a fence right around the Waipoua central block. Also, that's not a national park. There are probably difficulties in building fences in national parks. Another one I look at is Waitakere in Auckland, because that's a water supply area, just like Wainuiomata. Another one is Puriora Forest in central North Island. Maybe one around Coromandel somewhere, or even Bay of Plenty. Otani
Tane Wanuku.
Wanuku looks pretty good.
Yeah, it is
And
pretty good.
Taranaki. And so you look at distributing them in high quality habitat in strategic places. But the big thing is there would have to be a large halo zone around them. The bigger the better. So up to 100,000 hectares. And then you go into the South Island, you'd be looking at somewhere like Northwest Nelson. On the west coast, you'd look at somewhere like the Okarito Sanctuary area and Waitutu Forest in the south. So you'd go to those really, really, really good places, but they're not national parks. They're generally forest parks. And I think you'd stay away from the national parks
Why
unless
is
you can get.
why would you stay away from them? Like, is that just for
There's too many restrictive elements about the national park legislation, which
right?
would stop you from cutting down trees and driving fence lines and things like that. Even though they've all got roads going through them, they've tightened up on that a lot. But the big thing is to get representativeness, because hihi live in the North Island and brown creeper and mohua live in the South Island. They're different suites of species. You've got to cope with that geographic spread. And the big thing is to get scale, both in terms of the safe predator-free zone and also in the halo zone. So if you had 10 of them with up to, say, 3,000 hectares each, or around then you're talking about 20 to 30,000 hectares of predator-free habitat. Now, that's more than enough to secure all of the forest species that we have forever. And the good thing about distributing it like that across the country too is that you insure against catastrophe. So if there's a major drought in Northland, then the hihi there might be catastrophically affected, but the hihi in Wellington may not be. Or you might get a disease outbreak somewhere in the North Island, and with climate change coming, that's becoming more and more important.
Right. And would you need
Uh,
to build forest corridors connecting them all up for this to succeed, or is that just a nice to have? Because in my mind, I think let's connect them all so that then
no,
migratory.
you couldn't do that initially, but you would get because mainly the corridors that we have are around mountain backbones. In the North Island, it's extremely fragmented. If you look at a biodiverse forest map of the North Island, it's like a crazy quilt. The only place really you can do that with the corridor effect is on the west coast of the South Island, probably running from Marlborough through around the west down through to Southland. But you certainly couldn't do it on the east coast of the South Island. The east coast of the South Island and those other places, they need a different strategy. For instance, you'd still have your places like Wellington, where they're doing their own major restoration. But Wellington is about restoration, and that'll take hundreds of years because there's no forest there. You've got to set land aside, and you've got to rebuild, and it's done on a smaller scale and more patchworky. So in the South Island, it would be like places like Banks Peninsula, which
Mm.
you turn into a special restoration zone, or the
Like
Catlins,
Niwai
around the
Reserve.
Catlins.
Yeah.
You try and expand around the Catlins, or you try and expand around the Peel Forest in Timaru,
Yeah.
those sort of places, you see. You'd work outwards from existing pockets of habitat, but you'd have to be done on a small scale. Generally, you're not looking at you're looking at long time frames for that stuff to work. Hundreds of
Mm.
years.
But I guess nature works in a very slow way, right? So having a long time goal like that kind of is essential. But the other thing that I love about your idea is bringing threatened species to more people's backyards. Like when I go to Wellington, the culture around conservation, it's fantastic. Like to me, Zealandia kind of part of a culture change. And if we could have more places like that, just capturing more of the community, that would be a huge step forward.
Yeah, and it happens everywhere it goes. Mangatautari's got the same effect. Rokanui in Dunedin has the same effect. Even the local projects like the Kiwi project around Tauranga, they have massive effect. But the thing is, once you fence a place and you make it even more special, the multiplier, it becomes even more of you triple it. You triple the effect, really. It's quite dramatic.
So I guess the community need for conservation and biodiversity's need for community is actually a two-way street. Really, I was about to ask what would the role be of community in building these nationwide sanctuaries, given that Zealandia needed it so much. But I guess one thing you're saying is when you build a sanctuary, when you bring back the biodiversity, it creates the community. So, what do you think? Is that a bit of a revolving door between the two?
I think the community comes after you. It comes during the construction. People get excited about the startup. The startup, though, for the big sanctuaries, I think, has to be government and
Mm.
local authorities because they're just too big for community groups to cope with. And while Mangatautari has managed to build a large one, it is largely run by the council. The regional council fund a large proportion of that. And without the regional council and the Waipa District Council, that would probably not be viable. So you need these central and local government partnerships to kick the thing off.
You mentioned before, if I had a checkbook, here's what I would do. So, in Jim's checkbook, what's the number that needs to happen to make this survive?
Well, it's ridiculously affordable, actually. uh, so, so based on the quite detailed costings we did for Wainuiamata, which is a gold standard sanctuary project, really. My estimation is that it would cost about 30 to 35 million to establish one of these places. That's the capital outlay. That's doing the fencing, doing all the setup work with buildings and services, and clearing it of pests. That's your capital. And then after that, it would cost about 2.5 million a year to run one. And that's based also on Mangatautari's costings, as well as quite realistic costings done by people like the regional council staff. So this isn't just me plucking figures out of the air. These are numbers which have been arrived at by experts who are running current sanctuaries or pest production for. So then you'd need probably to double that operating funds, another 2.5 million to run the Halo zone, do a predator freestyle program across the Halo zone. So what you're talking about is about 35 million to start one, and about 5 million to run the nursery and Halo model. And then on top of that, then you build your education programs and your community programs and your economic programs as a separate item. They earn their own money. Eventually, they wind up earning their own money. If you don't have those, then there's no cost. You just run them as. So if you gross that up to 10, that's a capital of 350 million and about 50 to 60 million a year to run it.
So
And that's
that's not
highly
going to be all
affordable.
at once, though. That's you're not going to need 350 million today, right? It's
No,
something
no,
you do.
it would take 20 to 25 years to expend that money. So you're talking about an average of 10 million a year for a period. There'd be a bit of a hump in the middle there somewhere, and it'd tail off. So it would start slow. There'd be a big blob in the middle, and then it'd tail off. at maximum period, in about 10 years' time, you'd be spending about 70 to 80 million a year probably
Right.
as
So if
capital.
we,
And those capital is one-off. So capital is one-off.
yeah.
And then, of course, your operating expenses start low. They only start accumulating to 60 million when you get 10 of them going. So that's not until 20 years
20
down the track.
And
Yeah,
obviously, this excludes inflation and a lot of other detailed finance cost of
of course.
capital. But I'm pulling out my back of the napkin, doing a bit of punter maths, and I'm thinking, okay, let's round that up to 20 million a year capital cost. Let's round that up to, even if you just said it's 60 million a year from day one, which is way unrealistic, way overstated.
Yeah,
80
way
million a
overstated.
year. We've got 5 million people in New Zealand, so that's $16 per person per year. What's that, about 30 cents a week to end extinction and bring a future that we'd be proud to give to our children? Um,
Correct.
that seems like pennies. I mean, 30 cents a week. I spend $5 on a coffee.
Well, I think that's what's most exciting about this is that it is not anything near unaffordable. So there's several things here. One is we have the technology to do it now. It doesn't depend on anything that has to be invented to make this work. We know how to fence and we know how to clear places like fencing of pests and we know how to manage them. Secondly, we know how to relocate species, so we can do all that. Thirdly, we know how to build organisations that run these things. We've got dozens of them around the place now, and they work very well. The whole trust model, the multi-partnership trust model, works very well. It's a proven model. Thirdly, we know that as soon as you build these things, they just become massive social and economic hubs. People just are attracted to them like a magnet. And around Wainuiomata, for instance, the opportunities there to have a great walk that goes through the big forest with huts. There's already existing huts along the Rongrong River. You just link that up and do a great walk, and you'd be overwhelmed with people trying to get through there.
Yeah.
And the big thing you need from this is a change of policy. Not a change of policy, it just needs to be added to the existing policy. DOC already are talking about 10 large super areas, but they're talking about predator-free zones. And if that was encompassed with a core area of a fence sanctuary in the middle of those zones, then that would work very well. To be honest,
Because essentially, it's a predator-free offshore. It's like turning back time, isn't it, for the species to
that's
thrive?
yep, you're basically putting a lot of offshore islands around New Zealand, yeah, but with better impact. It's a massive bang for buck,
And I
absolutely
think,
massive bang for buck.
as far as speaking of bang for buck, we can talk about costs. We can talk about how it's, 30, 40 cents. I could be not quite accurate on that per week, per person for 25 years. It's really low cost in the scheme of things, especially when you think how much do we spend, a couple hundred million on a stadium. But the part of this calculation we haven't factored in is the financial benefits that we can't calculate. The extra
Yep,
tourism that comes to New Zealand, if biodiversity credits become a thing, the extra revenue from that, the ecosystem services that enable our primary industries to thrive. You've seen in
yep,
Cyclone Gabrielle absolutely decimating the east coast of the North Island.
yep,
That prevents erosion. It increases waterway quality. It increases the quality of our drinking water and our swimming lakes and rivers.
yep.
I think there's an argument that people that come to New Zealand for our nature are typically better tourists, or not better tourists, but potentially more money to spend, or more likely to talk about and share their experiences and bring more people here. I don't have stats on that, but that's more of an intuition and hunch than anything else. So, even just looking at the sunk costs, it's nothing. But I think there's an argument to be made that the return on investment in a traditional sense can be extremely high as well.
I think so. And if you, I mean, you can run numbers on these, but in most of it, you work on intuition
Hmm.
and logic. And frankly, I think the logic case for this is open and shut. I think it's rock solid. The part of the problem why this is not institutionalized now and why fence sanctuaries have a lot of difficulty getting up and running. There hasn't been a big one built since Brook, and that was planned well before that, actually. But part of the problem is that there was a paper written about 2010 which severely criticised the whole notion of fence sanctuaries, said that they were inefficient and too costly and the returns didn't warrant them. And I think that sort of coloured the whole argument in the wrong way. Now, that paper, to my way of thinking, was far too early. It was published in 2010, before sanctuary, the full effect of sanctuaries was apparent. So I think nowadays, if you were writing that paper and doing it objectively, it would be a completely different story. But the thing is, those things hang around like bad smells for a long time, of course.
Of course, yeah.
and people still refer to them as being valid. I didn't think they made the proper comparisons either. They didn't make any allowances for the social and economic impacts that sanctuaries could have. And that to me is a huge amount of the part of the equation. They also didn't even begin to get into the halo effect and the benefits that come from the halo effect. So that means that they missed out an awful lot of things which are now highly relevant and which are now proven as part of the time. So I think it's high time for a rethink on the whole thing. A bit baffling to me as to why people just who walk past with kaka flying over their heads every day don't say, "Oh, what's going on here?" This does work.
Yeah.
And
So,
I mean, New Zealand's reputation, of course, is massive for it, because Zealandia recently had quite a major article about it in the Guardian, and that went worldwide. So clearly, that if they're noticing it, why aren't the policymakers noticing it?
Yeah, for sure.
speaking of kaka flying over us and everything like that, if this were to succeed, like imagine 50 years ahead after that happened, what would that feel like? What could New Zealand look like? Like what would that mean for New Zealand long term?
Right. Well, it would mean a recovery of something like a small fragment of what we had before. So, I mean, New Zealand isn't what you'd call a biodiverse nation. It's actually a depauperate biodiversity we have. We're nothing like Australia. Australia has true biodiversity, unique creatures that it has biodiversity, plus it has uniqueness. So they're way ahead of us on the biodiversity stakes. Our fame is based on lack of biodiversity, like no mammals, or depauperate taxa in terms of things like butterflies and freshwater fish. We're very poor. There's 260 species of freshwater fish in the Mississippi River, and we have
Wow.
about 15. So so we're just pathetic when it comes to true biodiversity. But the big thing that New Zealand had was endemism, where about 70 or 80% of our species are endemic, and that's
That's
one of
where
the
it's
highest
found nowhere
levels of
else in the world.
endemism anywhere. Australia is the same sort of high level of endemism, of course, but we have a high level of endemism found nowhere else. But the other thing we had was abundance. Those old New Zealand forests would have been staggering for their carrying capacity. And we can't even begin to imagine what it would have been like. For a moment, pause to think of what, say, a Waikato kakatea swamp Maori Rimu forest, which went on for a million hectares, would have been like. The carrying capacity of that, one kakatea tree can carry about, in old money, 800 pounds, 200 or 300 kilograms of fruit,
Wow.
uh, half a ton of fruit. So, the numbers of birds that those old forests would have carried would have been just mind-boggling. And so we've lost any sense of that abundance. Even when you go to an offshore island, you don't get that level of abundance.
Mm.
Of course, we have lost diversity because we got a very high level of extinction as well. But we can get a fragment of it back, and you can see that in Karori. When you go into Karori, there are 400 saddlebacks there. 300 saddlebacks. There's 400 robins. You've got abundance. There's
Yeah.
50 or 60 pairs of kaka nesting in there every year, producing 2 or 3 chicks each that fly out into Wellington. So it's a constantly renewing resource. That's what we would have with this sort of thing. When you go to an offshore island, you get an element of it, but not what the old New Zealand forests were like, because
Nothing like
islands
that.
are dry, and most of
Yeah.
our islands have been badly modified. So Kapiti Island, for instance, where half of it was farmed, a good chunk of it was burnt. It's still recovering, and it does dry out. And things like robins find it quite difficult in summer on a dry year in Kapiti. But there is research conducted by Colin Miskelly and the OSNZ, which shows categorically that Karori's wildlife structure, bird structure, is rapidly tracking towards that of Kapiti Island, and they expect it to
Wow.
them to.
So, so it's 2024 at the time of this recording. If it went ahead and we clicked our fingers and we started the project, it'd probably be like 2050 by the time the 10 sanctuaries are in place. So,
Yep.
50 years from then, 2100, it seems hard to imagine that. I'm just wondering, let's say I fell into a cryogenic freezer and I woke up in 2100 and I, I was walking out to this future because of these mega sanctuaries taking place. How would that
Yep.
feel? I imagine I'd be a bit sick of
Well,
birdsong waking me up, and I'd be eating cake berries for breakfast on my muesli. I don't know.
well,
What does it look like? How does it feel?
we'd probably have 2,000 kakapo instead of 200.
Yeah, right.
We'd have tens of thousands of saddlebacks and things like that. They just wouldn't be anywhere near extinction, and there'd be multiple populations of those sort of species. For the ordinary species, though, like if there was, say, a nursery in the Waitakaris, you'd find pigeons flying all around people's gardens in Auckland, and
Right.
tuis in every garden in Auckland. They'd be a pest, and there'd be kaka flying all across cities all around New Zealand. That's the sort of thing that you'd be looking.
Just wrapping up our discussion. What are some? I mean, that'd be amazing, but we're not there yet. And people might be
No,
thinking, well, I can't give you $350 million to do this, but what can I do today? What are some practical actions I can take to help bring a future we want? And how can I help nature? What would you tell them?
the big thing is to influence a policy change. So if people can, if you're a forest and bird member, you need to get hold of the forest and bird senior people. So they need to advocate to their local MP and to the Minister of Conservation that there is a better way, and to forest and bird people, and to people who think that it's only about killing pests everywhere in New Zealand. That there is an option, and the other thing they can do is to take people to these sanctuaries, and let them see what they look like.
So, how can people get involved and support your work, or get in touch with you if they're interested in learning more about mega sanctuaries?
Yeah, sure. Just contact me through my website, jameslynch.org.
Just adding to that, if you want to learn more about Zealandia and about that journey, Jim, you wrote an amazing book. It really blew my mind, called Zealandia, of all topics. So you can find that online in
Yeah.
bookstores, right?
Some bookstores, yeah. The best place to get that would be to write to Unity Books in Wellington, and you can mail order it, and
Awesome.
they
Awesome.
stock it.
And last question of the 100,000,001 questions this chat. Um, what does conservation mean to you?
Well, it's a heritage thing, to be honest. When I was growing up, I deeply missed this whole business of not being able to see moa and huia. Just the fact that we lost so much of this wonderful heritage that was handed down to us, or should have been handed down to us, to be honest. It wasn't handed down to us. It was handed down to us in a shocking state.
Yeah.
And the story of how people fought in the 19th century and the 20th century to stop the carnage, which is what it was, and then make a bit of a recovery is quite uplifting. And that's what conservation is to me. It's about stopping the carnage, just recovering a little bit of what our heritage should be, and handing it along to the next generation. So I think that's what I've been most pleased with Zealandia, the whole Zealandia thing, is that that's something that will inspire people for generations to come.
It's just been such a pleasure to learn, to dig into what you're doing. And yeah, I wish you all the best in it. And maybe we can pick up this conversation down the line again and see where you've got to from there.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.